Now, Dr. Heiser, for example, he didn't like the idea that these fallen stars referred to fallen angels, and going back to that ancient tradition, the oldest story about the fallen angels. But in my view, if you take the ancient myths into account, if you understand this ancient Sumerian world, which is not the focus of Dr. Heiser's work, if you understand that, it's immediately clear that this is the same motive that we're talking about, in this case in a biblical context.
Today we take a close look at the time before the flood and what it was really like. So Willie, Dr. Michael Heiser often stressed the reading of the ancient texts through their own worldview. How much does that approach shape how we should compare Etana, Enoch, as well as Genesis?
Yes, Levi. So what we find is that this is actually very, very important and very true. We should understand ancient texts in terms of the worldview of the person who wrote the text. For example, the biblical worldview. We should understand when we read the Bible, so often we find that even scholars who do not have a feel for that very ancient world from which the text originated, they would read modern ideas and perspectives into the text. And their worldview were very, very different from ours. So when we read
they will look at it through a modern lens.
Absolutely. So when we read the Bible and when we read ancient texts more generally, we should be careful to make sure that we really we are very careful to really incorporate and understand as far as possible their perspectives, especially their worldviews. So this is very important. When we go back to the earliest of times, for example, we are now discussing the Antediluvian period, the time before the deluge. That's very, very, very long ago. And the oldest texts that we have that can throw some light on this period should be understood in these terms. We should understand how they understood the world, the cosmos, how everything come together. That can be called the speculative theology of those people. And from their texts, we have to reconstruct their speculative theology. We try to understand how they understood the world. That's very, very important. And so Dr. Heiser, for example, he specializes especially in the post-exilic period. And he focused very much on the Book of Enoch to a large extent. And that's why, for example, Mount Hermon is very important in his way of thinking. And many of the things that he explained and that he teaches comes from that perspective, the post-exilic period. And the period and how those people understood these things and the worldview of that time. But when we go back to this earliest period, this period that's really, really, really old, we have to look and see how those people in these texts, how they understood the world. And it was very different, even from the people of the post-exilic period. It's two very different worlds, I can tell you that.
So I think it makes it a lot easier as well to compare Etana, Enoch, and Genesis if you have that specific worldview that blankets it. So easier to compare the traditions and everything that goes with that.
Yeah, so what we can do is if we take the biblical tradition, the early biblical tradition, we read in the Bible that Abraham came from Ur in Sumer. And when we have a close look at the primeval history, that's Genesis 1 to 11, it has a different character, a different literary style than the rest of the book of Genesis, and is nowhere else found in the Bible. In fact, it's found nowhere else in the world except in the form of the Sumerian king list. Now, the Sumerian king list dates from the time of Abram. That's about the Eastern Larsa period. So what we find is that these two documents are very, very similar. To such an extent, it's not only the literary style that corresponds, it's also that many of the figures in these two different historiographies, there's actually two to efforts towards writing a kind of history of that early period. In the one case, it's a prehistory of the Abrahamic family, and the other case, it's the early history of the Sumerian world. We find that similar figures appear in both these traditions, figures that seem to be exactly the same person. Because remember, Abraham comes from Sumer. That's the world in which his forebears lived. So that's actually expected that they would share certain traditions and certain personages from that ancient times, yes.
Beautiful. So really zooming out when reconstructing something this old from fragments, what are your strongest anchor points? And what are you most careful not to sort of overbuild?
So we should immediately understand that the period before the deluge goes back very, very far back in history. It goes back to the time before writing was discovered. At that time, there was no cuneiform writing. It was not yet discovered. In fact, cuneiform writing was only discovered some time after the deluge. So even the period, the post-Diluvian period, is also a period where they didn't have writing available. It was towards the end of the Uruk period that they discovered phonetic writing. And it was only much later, in about 2500 BC, that we have the first literary texts. But what they did have was poets. Poets that was, because there wasn't writing, it wasn't available, they had to know all these stories by heart. It's like the Jews knowing the Bible by heart, the Old Testament by heart, the Hebrew Bible. Or, in ancient times, these people had the ability to memorize large pieces of information. And these poets, they memorized these traditions, these stories. And we know, for example, a very important case is the daughter of King Sargon of Akkad. Her name is Etana. He lived in about 2300 BC. She wrote 3 very beautiful poems in honor of the goddess Inanna. And what she says in one of her poems is that she actually speaks towards the poets themselves and says that you must accurately verbatim repeat this poem. So she wrote it down, but it's also important for them to know it by heart. So they knew these things by heart, these stories. And eventually in the early 3 period, for the most part, many of these early Sumerian stories and traditions were first written down. So this is very important. We should understand that for that early period, especially the antediluvian period that we are discussing today, we don't have first-hand knowledge. We don't have history in the sense that some eyewitness accounts or something exist. It doesn't exist. So it's very difficult, that very early period, to reconstruct that period, truly understand it. And what we're trying to do today is to try and determine what it was really like during that period. Because so often, for example, in the Book of Enoch, we have a certain perspective that was written down about 3,000 years after the deluge. And only because the authors, the Jewish authors that was in exile, came into contact with the Babylonian world, the Babylonian history, and they immediately saw these correspondences, and they put 2 and 2 together, and they understand that Etana, for example, in the Sumerian tradition, which we have spoken about, and you have also already mentioned him, is the same person as Enoch in the biblical tradition. And from that, they reconstructed this story. But, it was 3,000 years later, and we cannot use that to get a realistic picture of the antediluvian period. That's not good hermeneutics in my view.
Yeah, and it's important not to be speculative when we start reconstructing these things.
Well, to some extent, we're busy speculating. We can't move beyond that, but we try to be very careful in our analysis of the texts and understanding. And especially, what we do is we use the text on the one hand, and we use archaeological evidence on the other hand, and we bring these things together. For example, the earliest known royal inscription is of Enme Baragesi, and he dates from the end of the Yemnet Nasser period. That's and the beginning, I would say the beginning of the first dynastic period. That's about 2800 BC. But for that period, we have the first royal inscription. So Mebaragesi, king of Kish. So from that on, so what we do, we must be careful to correlate what we find in archaeology and what we find in the textual history, to bring these two together and to synthesize. And also when we work with different traditions, for example, the biblical tradition and the Sumerian tradition, and later on the Babylonian tradition, which came much later, which is not that trustworthy, to really get a good picture of that early period.
Yeah, if I look at your 9 Ages book as well, there's a lot of emphasis on chronology and migration patterns as well, which I always find very interesting.
Yeah.
So Willie, you often speak of continuity in the ancient Near East. Do you see the antediluvian world as one shared stream that later split, or separate traditions that simply, I could say, rhyme?
So there is the forefathers of Israel. They lived in Sumer. We found that in the Bible. It's called Shinar, the land of Shinar. That's just the same as Sumer. So they lived in that world. The name Abraham is actually attested to in the old Babylonian period within that, in the south of Mesopotamia. Now, according to the Bible, Abram's forebears included, for example, Enoch. That's in the time before the deluge. And Enoch, if he corresponds with Etana, and the previous episode that we had was focused on those two figures, which I believe is the exact same figure. What we find is that he was from the house of Kish. The house of Kish was one of the most important royal dynasties in the ancient Mesopotamian world. It means that Abram was born from that royal family. It was like the line of David in later Israelite history. It was an extremely important lineage. And this lineage, we can understand that they had poets, in-house poets, and they had scribes, and so forth. And that's why these traditions had been handed over so nicely within the framework of biblical tradition, yeah.
So just to build on that, when you compare Etana and Enoch, where does the parallel feel the strongest, and where does it start to weaken?
Yeah, so what we then find is these two, the Semites, the forebears of Abram, and the Sumerians, they lived in the very same land from the earliest of times. In the Antediluvian period, the time of Enoch, called Etana, in my opinion, in Sumerian tradition. That was long, long ago, before the time of the deluge, but they were the Semites. At the same time, the Sumerians lived to the south in Sumer, in Eridu. And from that time on, these peoples lived in the same land. They shared the same traditions. They knew the same stories. That's why the stories are so similar. Obviously, there are some changes and some differences to the stories. There are different perspectives, especially later on in the Babylonian tradition when there came a lot of distortion into the picture. But the point of the matter is, these stories go back to the same original tradition and the same original events. And that's why when one take Etana and when one take Enoch, for example, they are so similar. On the one hand, for example, Etana means he that went to heaven. It's the same that we find with Enoch, he that went to God. Now, with Enoch, it's only a small sentence, just a very short passage that we have about him in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. But with regard to Etana, we have an entire epic that was written about his what things that happened to him and so forth. And we gain a much better picture in a certain sense. Now, what is interesting is not that they only both went to God. They have both had a very close relationship in their stories with the Supreme God. They also appear seventh in the list from the first original person in their respective lists. For example, in the ancient Sumerian king list, not the well-known one, another one that was later discovered a few years ago that goes back to the Akkadian period, and where the house of Kish is actually extremely important and mentioned. In this list, Etana is mentioned 7th. Some lists also mention him 11th. That's true. But the fact that he's mentioned 7th tells us that the Sumerians regarded him as a very special figure, in the same way that he is also understood in the Hebrew tradition, in the Israelite tradition. So there's so many similarities between them, but there are also some details that we find, especially with regard to the Sumerian tradition, that's not mentioned in the Bible. For example, Etana was the very first king. And the Semites, we know, they were great warriors from the earliest of times. So the original meaning of king was a warrior leader. It was not like the Sumerians. They didn't have warriors and warrior leaders, especially not in the time before the deluge. They had fertility priests. It was a priestly kind of rulers that they had. It's only after the deluge, when these two different peoples started to intermarry and when these two traditions came together and fused and so forth. But in the time before the deluge, it was very different. And especially during that particular period, we get a good insight from Etana's story that was handed down in Mesopotamia about the happenings of that time, and that helps us to get a broader perspective of the world in which Enoch lived also, because the Bible doesn't tell us a lot about that.
Yes, very, very interesting. So that eagle-serpent tension in Etana is actually fascinating. Do you see that as cosmology, politics, or something deeper embedded in the myth itself?
Yeah, so in the myth of Etana, we have this conflict between the eagle and the snake. In the previous episode, we discussed it in some detail. But we can link the eagle, with Etana. It was the eagle that took him to the throne of God. And so on the one hand, we have the Semites. And I believe that the eagle was the symbol used by the Semites, original symbol used by the Semites who lived in Kish. Kish was just to the north of Sumer. On the other hand, to the south at Eridu, that's the oldest city and the oldest sanctuary in Sumer, the snake was very important. We've discovered many images. The imagery of serpents are very important, especially during the Ubaid period. That's the time before the deluge at Eridu. So we know the serpent was important at Eridu. So what we find is this conflict between the serpent and the snake tells a story. It's a story about the conflict between the Semites and the Sumerians during this early period. Now, this conflict was not only between two people sharing this land. It was also because their ideologies, their theologies were very different. We have the earliest lists of gods, for example, that came from Sumer, a list that dates back to about 2500 BC. And on the one hand, we have the supreme god An. Now, he corresponds with the Semite El, which we also find later on, the supreme god in Ugaritic tradition and in biblical tradition in the book of Genesis. And it was just that the Sumerians called El An. An means heaven. And in this one list, this list starts with him and then his son-in-law and so forth, other gods. The gods are not paid. They don't have consorts. On the other hand, on the other list, we have Enki, where An's name means heaven. Enki means Lord of the earth. And he's paired with Ninki, the lady of the earth. So the Lord and the lady of the earth. To have the heaven contra the earth. So the one list had been described as cosmic or heavenly by scholars. And the other list had been described as Teutonic or earthly. So we have very different ideologies. The one focused on the celestial, on the supreme god. The other focused on fertility rituals, and that's why the pairs, the consorts, are so important in this list. So that shows us...
And then you've got the Axis Mundi.
Yeah, so we have this real conflict between these two groups of people in that earliest time before the deluge in the land in southern Mesopotamia. Yes, in Kish, Eridu, and Sumer and that region, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So really, with the idea of fallen seed across all of these early traditions, do you see a shared memory of something real or a symbolic language for divine human contact?
Now, the motive of fallen seed are extremely important. Seed actually refers to, in that early period, to sons or children. It's often used. For example, Anunnaki. That's the terminology that we find in ancient Sumer that was used for the god. Anunnaki means the seed of Nun. Nun just means prince, and originally it referred to An, the supreme god, the seed of the supreme god. It's the equivalent term of what we later on find in Ugarit, but also in biblical tradition as the sons of God. So the sons of God in this earliest period, it was the seed of the supreme God. Now, some of these seeds fell on the ground. This is very important because this is regarded in that time. There can be no doubt that had a reference to the fallen gods. And especially Enki was closely connected with this motive. His seed fell on the ground, and from that came forth 8 gods that was born on earth. And this is the point where the Nephilim enters tradition. So the idea of fallen seed, fallen gods, the Nephilim that was at that time through the sacred marriage came into being, especially at Eridu, closely give us a good picture of what we later on find in a much more refined style when the Bible was written thousands of years later, where it was called the fallen gods. And we find the same motive in the book of Revelation. For example, in chapter 12, we read that the great dragon, he actually cast a third of the stars of heaven on the earth. And this is the exact same motive. In that case, earliest case, we had this crude motive of seed falling on the earth. Now we have, in the biblical context, the stars falling on the earth. And stars throughout the Bible, we've discussed that in one of the previous episodes, often was used as a symbol for the angels, for the gods. Even the terminology gods is found in the in the Hebrew Bible, for example, in Psalm 82, etc. Now, Dr. Heiser, for example, he didn't like the idea that this fallen stars referred to fallen angels, and going back to that ancient tradition, the oldest story about the fallen angels. But in my view, if you take the ancient myths into account, if you understand this ancient Sumerian world, which is not the focus of Dr. Heiser's work, if you understand that, it's immediately clear that this is the same motive that we're talking about, and this case in a biblical context. So this the fallen seed, the fallen gods. We've clearly find that within the time framework of the pre-deluge period, and it's very, very old. And with that, also the stories about the Nephilim.
Perfect. So trick question. On the Nephilim, do you lean towards remembered figures later mythologized or archetypical boundary beings explaining a theological problem?
Yeah, so the Nephilim, if you read the place where we find the Nephilim in the primeval histories in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, where the sons of God actually fathered these beings with human maidens. Now, the reason why it's included here in this primeval history in the book of Genesis is not because it's something new that is actually mentioned here. It's part of the old tradition, the oldest traditions. We also find the very same idea in the Sumerian king list. In fact, the idea of Nephilim, of ones that was born from the gods, of the fallen gods, is extremely old. We find, for example, in the Sumerian king list that the Sumerian house of Uruk was descended from the gods. In the epic of Enmerkar, for example, we read that he is the son of the sun god. Gilgamesh, who was also a scion of the house of Uruk, we read that he was partially divine. He was born from a superhuman being, a Lilu diamond. We've discussed that already. And he was regarded as 2/3 a god. So the stories or the tradition about Nephilim was ingrained in the very fabric of ancient Mesopotamian tradition. It's not something that was sort of an add-on or just an interesting part or an interesting story. Definitely not. It was part of the fabric of society. That's how they understood the world. They understood these ancient personages, this ancient dynasty of Uruk. They understood them to have been descended from the gods. And they actually came after the deluge, but it's quite clear from other traditions that we can also incorporate in this regard, and we've discussed it already in some episodes. For example, the Edfu texts, which also bear on these very same antediluvian traditions, that the Nephilim definitely existed from a Mesopotamian perspective in the time before the deluge. Yes, it's a very own tradition.
I find it really interesting how the Nephilim was absolutely ingrained in these traditions, and in our modern times we've largely, I wouldn't say lost it, but it's not part of normal tradition anymore. But over the last few years, almost like there's a rediscovery.
Absolutely.
Of the information. Any comment on that? Why do you think there's a rediscovery of the Nephilim?
I think Dr. Heiser actually had much to do with that. His interest in the Book of Enoch and these books that he wrote, for example, The Unseen Realm, had a major influence in Christian theology and Christian circles, especially scholarly circles, because he did his doctorate on the Divine Council, which is also very important and part of a very ancient tradition. I think he played a very important role. Before that time, it was, more people that didn't have a scholarly background that spoke about these things, and, I think most people didn't really take it serious. But now it's become very much part of a serious discussion, and that's a good thing, because according to the biblical perspective, in my view, we also find that the return of the Nephilim is an important theme that we have in the Bible, and again in the book of Revelation. And we'll come to that and discuss that in future, Lord willing.
Yeah. Wonderful. So a final comment from my side is it seems that the antediluvian world looks less like a single story and more like fragments of the same memory seen from different sides. Maybe not conflicting accounts, just one event remembered differently. Any other comments around that?
No, I agree. That's, I think, a good summary.
Yeah. So I do have a question for the listeners. If the oldest stories in the world keep circling the same themes, descent, ascent, fallen light, hybrid beings, are we hearing history or the echo of something the human mind has never fully stopped translating? Do not hesitate to give us your opinion, and we love the lively discussions that's been going on our feed as well, so really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Any other comments, Willie?
No, I agree with you, absolutely. It'll be nice to hear from the community also, and their perspectives and input. And some of the things that they actually ask also lead to reflection on our side, where we, for example, see that certain stuff had to be backed out in more detail and clarified and so forth. So it's quite nice to hear from everybody.
Absolutely. And some really, really interesting questions. So we really appreciate you guys taking the time. And please, again, like and subscribe.
Yes, please do.
Thank you, Willie.
Thank you, Lebay.